To welcome you all to tonight's meeting, Bonfire of Liberties. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers tonight, incredibly inspiring. Gareth Peirce is one of whom is the bastion of the oppressed and a defender of all our rights, and has an incredible record. Two of the other speakers, Mazzam, Begg and Winston Silcott, have actually experienced firsthand so-called system of justice. And have come out fighting, and they're an absolute inspiration, I think. I'm chairing this evening. My name's Becky Palmer, and I live in Newham, and I'm a Unison steward. Each speaker will have about 10 minutes to speak, and there'll be plenty of time for discussion and questions. There will be speakers' slips going round. Please feel free to, if you don't want to get up and speak, to actually just ask a question, and I'll read it from the platform. But please feel free to get up and speak, even if it's just a short point or a question as well. And so, without any further ado, I'll bring in Mazzam.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I get sort of overawed sometimes by this sort of reception, and it's really difficult to imagine that perhaps a year and a half ago, I wasn't sure whether I was going to spend the rest of my life in an 8x6 cell, or perhaps face execution at the hands of the United States of America's military in Guantanamo Bay. Yet here I am, talking, sometimes here in the middle of London, sometimes to Middle England, sometimes to my own Muslim community, about an issue that I thought no longer existed, at least in the free and democratic world, and that is torture, that is rendition, kidnap, abduction, beatings, the removal of rights that are given to animals, and not even given to human beings. I was asked a few months back to make a presentation to the Law Society about a question which was, is torture ever justified? And I thought, this is rather odd. Why would lawyers be discussing this issue? And of course, the answer to that is that it's not a legal issue. Lawyers don't need to be discussing the issue of whether torture is justified. It's a moral issue. It's an issue about wanting to redefine its meanings and what it purports to. And I wasn't around at the time, but since my release I've read about the memo that was passed around the White House and the Pentagon about reinterpreting and redefining what torture could now be. So it could include, according to this memo, the twisting of arms, not the breaking of them, because that's torture, but the actual twisting of the arm is fine. Organ failure. For something to constitute torture, it could include organ failure or even death. And how strange it is that a few months ago, I was asked to speak in Edinburgh. And I'm somebody who enjoys, strangely enough, a part of my so-called British heritage, British history. I like going to visit castles. And you can guess where the next part is, because in the castle there's a part that I was attracted to in Edinburgh, almost like a magnet. And this was called the Prisons of War section. And as I descended to the bowels of this dungeon, this subterranean set of cells that was built for 19th century prisoners of war, I walked into one of these cells. The door was open, and to my surprise, I wasn't as frightened as I'd felt initially when I was taken to Guantanamo. The cell was twice the size of the cell that I'd been in. And it had the added benefit of a window, something that I'd never had in Guantanamo. And as I had this sort of flashback to Guantanamo Bay, can you believe it? I actually started hearing American voices. They were real. They weren't part of my imagination. Then on top of it, I heard doors slam and bolts being closed. And then I started, just for a second, to get a little scared. But nobody bolted my door. As I walked out, I realized it was American tourists. A Freudian slip. And I walked up the stairs thinking, my goodness, if only these people knew. Now, my experience of the Americans, of course, and I've said it quite often before for those of you who've heard, and I've written it about it in my book extensively, is that, it's important for me as a person to be just, even to those people who are unjust to me, not to reciprocate the anger or the ignorance. Because once we do that, we fall down the same path as the people who've tainted us with the brushes of terrorists and murderers and killers, which is what all of us in Guantanamo and elsewhere held in this war on terror have been painted. Indeed, I still am regarded as an enemy combatant, according to the definition of an enemy combatant. Although the first thing you learn about an enemy combatant is that you don't actually have to be an enemy or a combatant to be an enemy combatant. But that's really peripheral. The important part about all of this is that there was a time, and Gareth knows this better than anybody else here in this country apart from my family, when I was designated to be tried by a military commission. The same military commission that today, in the case of Hamdan versus Bush, has been proved to be unequivocally and unanimously illegal. But Guantanamo Bay still exists. I was deemed to be one of the most dangerous people on earth. Can you imagine that? So watch your backs. But in all seriousness, by the most powerful man on earth and the most stupid, I was deemed to be one of the most dangerous people on earth. And I was going to be processed through this system, which only Australia recognizes, strangely enough, of a kangaroo court. Military commissions, other than America, because the first person that was going to be processed and is being processed through this commission process is the Australian David Hicks. And John Howard's government has completely agreed and shaken hands with the Americans over this. And to the credit, at least of the British government on this issue, that after much embarrassment, after much pressure, after much campaigning in this country, they eventually did not agree to these military commissions and had us Britons repatriated. But the thing continues. My experience of the Supreme Court decision that was passed in 2004, that was the last Supreme Court decision passed in the case called Rasool versus Bush. And Rasool, for those of you who don't know, is actually Shafiq Rasool, one of the Tipton Three. And despite its tangible, practical effects, the history books and the records in the Supreme Court of the United States of America will always show that when Rasool came up against Bush, Rasool won. And before you give me too much credit for this, I've taken that from Gareth. But also, in the case of Hamdan versus Bush, Hamdan has won. And if you think about who Hamdan is, and think again now what the type of rhetoric and the language that's been used in the war on terror, particularly when the United States of America government have spoken about these so-called commissions or trials. They've said, not since Nuremberg have we had anything like this. So when you think of Nuremberg, of course, who do you think of? Adolf Eichmann, Rudolf Hess. Perhaps now in recent times you think of Slobodan Milosevic, war crimes, mass murders, gas chambers. But the first person that they want to try through this, apart from David Hicks, who is the Australian, is Osama bin Laden's right-hand driver. Yes, they got the driver. They're going for the cook next, but they've got the driver first and they're going to put him through his paces. Now, we're all led to believe that these are the extremely terrifying and dangerous people on earth that they have in Guantanamo Bay, and they deserve no right at all. As has been argued in one of the cases for the respondents, or for the defendants in Guantanamo, that even the iguana in Guantanamo Bay is a protected species. If it's damaged, hurt, or even killed, inadvertently or otherwise, this offending soldier or civilian can expect to pay a fine of up to $10,000. Not so with the detainee, not so with the human being, not so with the person who's been so dehumanized that he has no rights. When we were first taken into custody in Bagram and indeed Guantanamo Bay, one of the things we were told is that you are now the property of the United States of America. You have no rights. And this is the issue here. This is the crux of the matter. That regardless what you're supposed to have done, and believe me, despite the rhetoric also, the President Bush calling us the most dangerous people on earth, there are some very dangerous people that have been locked up around the world for all sorts of crimes. But they've had access to the law. The rule of law applied for them. Guantanamo Bay is this place, and indeed others that we don't know about, like Diego Garcia and Bagram and elsewhere, where the rule of law just doesn't apply. Sometimes people ask me before in the past about, well, do you think there are people there that are innocent or guilty? There must be somebody. I mean, they can't all be innocent, surely. But these are luxuries, these terms are, that we can have in the West, or in the free West, where we can say, this person may be guilty, this person may be innocent, the rule of law, habeas corpus, all of these terms matter here. Over there, they don't matter, they don't exist. You're just in custody, and that's all that matters. That's what I was saying about the Supreme Court decision that was passed in 2004 in Rasool versus Bush, said that the detainees had the right for habeas corpus cases to be brought before the court in the United States of America. But in tangible, practical terms, it meant nothing. The victory meant nothing. Not one detainee to this day has been brought before the court in the United States of America and been charged or convicted. And not one detainee has been released as a result of court and legal proceedings because, as I said to you, law does not matter. The only things that the lawyers there can do, and anybody who understands the client-attorney privilege would find it extremely difficult to be able to operate in the environment of Guantanamo Bay's detention camps. So, despite this whole chorus of people calling for the closure of Guantanamo Bay, the erosion of rights of people in Guantanamo Bay, nothing has happened. And I can't see anything tangibly happening unless there is a stronger voice that calls for the closure of that place. But not only that, this is just the tip of the iceberg. It really is. When I was being released from Guantanamo Bay, one of the things I heard about and was told is that Britain had its own mirror of Guantanamo Bay, and that was Belmarsh. It was strange because the night that I was brought into Paddington Green as my welcome back into the country, I met Gareth, and she was telling me about the House of Lords decision that had found the detention of the Belmarsh detainees to be illegal after 3 years. And this was taking place in this country. The difference was that at least in Guantanamo Bay, I'd been interrogated 300 times, sometimes with a gun to my head, but I'd been interrogated. The Belmarsh detainees hadn't even been interrogated. They hadn't even been questioned, because that would have meant that a lawyer would have to be present. So this is the type of world that I came back into. And post 7/7, it's changed much worse. Just passing on the way to here, I didn't realize that we were passing Tavistock Square. And I started getting some of those feelings that I had post 7/7. It's very difficult for people from the Muslim community, particularly people who've been deemed to be so-called terrorists, that this question mark is always looming over your head, and you continue and plead to try and argue the case for your innocence. But the judgments, in essence, in one way, have already been made. You've already been labelled a terrorist. And anybody who's ever been labelled anything at all, whether it's any crime, anybody who's been labelled to have committed some sort of crime without the access to justice, or with the gross misapplication of justice, how do you remove that? What do you do to remove this? The answer is that you fight back. That you go into the heart of the dragon, into the heart of the beast, and you tell them as it is, and as long as you're able to do so, that's one of the most important things for me. That's why it's been so important for me, listening to my father and knowing about the campaign that he made for me, and almost taking the baton from him and continuing what he began. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mazzam. Incredibly powerful speech. I would urge people to buy Mazzam's book, and he is actually signing it at the end on the stage here.
Yeah, buy the book or we send the boys round.
Yeah, you better be buying the book then, really. I just want to read to you what Jon Snow says about the book. He says, "From Wordsworth and Shakespeare to the illegal inhumanity of the war on terror, if those responsible read only one book about what they have tolerated and done in our name, this must be it." I'd like to introduce Winston Silcott.
First, I must say, is this on? Hello? 1, 2. Okay. First, I must say good evening, and it's good to see a good turnout here today, right? And it's my first Marxism, right? And the years I spent in prison, I got tremendous support from socialist workers and other acted bodies who supported me throughout my prison stay. And I want to thank you all for that. Well, my journey, or I'd call it my illegal incarceration, started in 1985, where I was wrongly accused for killing a police officer, Keith Blakelock. And when I was arrested, I thought, this is a joke. They just try to put fear into me. As the process went on, I saw there was really serious. So once I was charged, I wasn't devastated because I could see something was, there was a, how can I put it? There was a reenactment, there was a play, what was going in front of my eyes, and I wasn't really part of it, but I was the main lead. So as the months went on, and there was no evidence forthcoming to my solicitors, so I was saying, why am I in prison? There's no evidence. The police hasn't brought no evidence to solicitors, and they thought it's strange because usually the solicitors have some sort of evidence to say, well, this is what they've got you in prison for. So then I started to do some inquiry myself, like with the other people who were arrested through the disturbances, and there was a similar trait. And then I started hearing stories how people was arrested without solicitors, without knowledge of their parents, right? People being kept in incommunicado, and even youngsters of the age of 13, 14, withheld in prison with no supervision at all. So I was thinking, this can't be right. This is England. We've got the law. And me, when in my young's day, I'm not going to say I was an angel. So I thought, well, you've got the law there to protect you. So if you keep your mouth shut, you get a solicitor or whatever. So as the months went on, and I was seeing the same old trait there, that solicitors were denied or information wasn't getting to solicitors. Some solicitors even deemed the police deemed them as crooked. Said unwittingly they're going to feed information onto like families and friends who want to know the whereabouts of their loved ones who've been arrested. Now, when I think back, I think to myself, this was a ploy by not just the police, the judicial system, right, and the state. They all had a hand in it to portray this image of a people who lived on the Broadwater farm. Because my other gripe was with the media. The media, I don't know if you know what the media done to me, right? They demoned me off. They done everything humanly possible. They called me all the names underneath the sun, right? And even though I went through that, I just thought, what could be done? Because this is not right. So I decided, well, boy, I've got to pull up my boots, right, and start fighting back. Don't let nobody fight for me. I've got to fight back. And bit by bit, you take small chunks out of not just the system, but just how things were. And the main thing is what people started to listen. Because as far as I'm concerned, this is my personal belief, like the media, right, is just how could I put it? It's just it's a state-controlled. It's a state-controlled organisation, right? Because what it does, it brainwashes people, and that's the best way I can put it. Because I don't rate myself as though an intellect, so you're not going to get no big words from me, right? But it brainwashes people because I'm going to tell you the truth. At one stage, I was thinking, wow, who's that guy? Right? Then I realized it was me. Right? And I was going, well, that's not me. I have made mistakes. You know what I mean? As an adolescent, I made mistakes, and I thought, well, but the way they portray me, that is totally somebody else. You know? So when I, like I said, pulled my boots up and I started to fight back, I saw that there are chinks in their armour. You can gain victories. You might not make the major victories, but you can win, right? So basically, what I'm just trying to say to you today, what happened back then is still happening today. Now, for instance, I'm not avid reader of the media, right? And on my way here, I was talking to Wayman, right? We was talking about the media. Now, I couldn't tell you the facts because, as far as I'm concerned, you're not going to get the facts from the newspapers or the media. Like, for instance, the recent shootings, what I know down in East London, as soon as I saw it, I knew it was a lie. When the Brazilian man got shot, right, I knew it was a lie. Because that, like I said, that instrument, the media, it's just there to confuse us, right? And not just confuse us, because obviously there are people who will see that for what it is. But there are a lot of people who are suggestible. They would see certain things, right? And they would take it on board. Now, what I'm just trying to do to link up my case with them similar cases is with the media aspect. Because even today, now, the media like to chat rubbish. So if there's any media in the house, I did say what I said today. Yeah? But anyway, when it comes to rights, right, and the system kicks into gear, right, initially you have no rights, right? And I'm just hoping and praying for a day where there's going to be our voices or United Kingdom's voices, where they're going to put certain things into place, right, or certain protocols into place where the system cannot mess about with certain things. Because what I've noticed, if there's a law, right, it's down to a judge's discretion. If there's a law, right, somebody can twist the law, they can get round it. And I'm just hoping that there's a day, there's certain things put into place where the bodies that run this country, right, and run the world can't play with it. Okay, thank you very much.
And now, last but not least, Gareth Peirce.
No, first, get this straight. Does it work? Just about. Okay. In view of the fact this is an audience that knows enough to give a standing ovation to Mazzam, Begg and Winston Silcott, I go on the assumption you really don't need to be told anything by me. You know it all. I went for a hospital appointment a couple of days ago, and as I was coming out, a man in a white coat came up to me, a worker in the hospital, and spent the next half hour talking to me about Mazzam, Begg, about the Tipton Three, about Forest Gate 2, about John Charles Menezes, and I came to the conclusion that everybody knows everything. I may have it wrong because I was a bit busy this last week, but I thought there was a title to this meeting. I thought, have I got it wrong, that it was Bonfire of Our Liberties, which I thought was very apt. I hadn't heard that word used before. And we are endlessly having to regenerate vocabulary and language to find new ways of saying what it is that's happening, what is this phenomenon that is sweeping our country and most countries in the world. Bonfire seemed to me a good, strong term, something frightening, something ugly, an incineration, something dramatic and something final. And that seemed to cover a great deal of what we know, what you all know. So what we have to think about, perhaps, is how we translate our shock and horror at that incineration into something else, and how we look for what we don't see, because it isn't public and it isn't bright and it isn't a fire that we can see. And much of what has gone on and is going on is what we don't see and what is covert. It's bad enough if there is new legislation and Parliament, in its totally inadequate way, debates and then passes inevitably that legislation, whatever it demands, an insatiable appetite for taking away rights. But most of what goes on and is the worst and the ugliest has come upon us for reasons that are never explained and never made public and are entirely meant to be secret forever. And the thesis is, in effect, that much of it is premised on the issue of national security. That's the claim. Our nation's security depends upon executive steps that are being taken that are necessary, but because it is national security, these can't be made known. They have to be secret. And so it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The executive, in anything that is uncomfortable, is able to say, you have to trust us because it involves national security, and because it involves national security, we can't tell you the evidence, so you can scrutinize it and debate it. And so many of the measures that have been taken that are so appalling have been taken in that executive loop and have avoided a great deal of what would have shocked, I hope, shocked this country if it had known about it. And when Winston was talking about his experience now many years ago, when many young people, I don't remember how many, but I believe it was more than 50, is that right, Winston? From Broadwater Farm, young people and including children were locked up in police stations until, under coercion and threats, with no lawyers present, they have been forced into confessions or into providing information about others. And it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. What the interrogators wanted, they obtained from those witnesses or defendants they were pressuring, and in turn what they obtained, they came to believe was the truth. Now, gradually, over the years, what happened in those police stations around Broadwater Farm came to be seen as a national disgrace. It came to be that all police interviews had to be tape recorded, had to be videotaped, there had to be solicitors present. There was not to be a repetition of that. And one case after another, many, many Irish men and women were found, to the shock of this country, to the shock of people here, to have spent 15, 16, 17, 18 years imprisoned here, completely innocent, just like Winston. And nobody knew, nobody had known, nobody cared. And there was meant to be a sea change. And that is what we should see and experience now, but it isn't. It's the exact opposite. But much of it is avoiding what would demand open and very angry debate. If we were to have a debate that we were abolishing jury trial in this country, it would involve many allies from all political parties, all persuasions. It's a fundamental right. So what have we done? We have avoided jury trial for a number of people, but we've never had a debate about it. In 2001, December, we locked up a number of men indefinitely without trial. We said it was a necessary response to terrorism, that it was our equivalent of George Bush's Patriot Act. We said that the evidence against them was based on intelligence and therefore couldn't stand scrutiny in a court, and it couldn't be seen or heard by a jury or indeed by the accused person. All of it was to be heard before a Special Immigration Appeals Commission. Now, like colleagues, I'm a plain, ordinary, unreconstructed defence lawyer, but I've spent the last nearly 5 years of my life in the basement of the Special Immigration Appeals Commission, not because I've acquired any new skills. I'm not an immigration lawyer, but it's because they have moved what I know. A person accused of involvement in terrorism, they've moved it from the criminal court to that basement, Court 1, Special Immigration Appeals Commission, where we don't know the evidence. It's all in secret. We're told to go when the real evidence starts. But just occasionally you find out what has been going on. a man behind a curtain called Witness A, intelligence officer. Just occasionally you can ask a question in the short piece of the proceedings that is in what they call open session. Do you use evidence obtained from torture? The surprising answer, yes. We'll use anything. The only question is, what weight do we give it? We avoided jury trials. We abolished jury trials for those men. We've avoided the process of recognition of absolutely central international obligations. We have an obligation to avoid torture. We have an absolute binding international obligation not to send anyone to torture, not to allow anyone to be tortured. We have avoided our responsibilities, and we have torn up our obligations by default, covertly, without discussion. We have colluded in the unlawful abduction of people like Mazzam Begg from Pakistan by unknown American, Pakistani, and British agents. We have been there. We have tipped them off. We have told them where to find people. And then we have gone, our intelligence agents, and enjoyed the process of coercive, torturous interrogation. And we have come home with the product. And that's what we're doing in the secret sessions in SIAC with people who've been denied the right to jury trial. We are complicit in the policy of rendition, of transferring people from one country to another to be tortured. We send information to assist the torturers. In doing this without any public discussion, we have unilaterally torn up our obligations under the United Nations Convention against Torture. When our government is asked to intervene, as it was asked to intervene in the case of Mazzam Begg, to make a complaint against the United States, a formal complaint which only the government can do, the individual right to make that complaint has not been ratified by this country. When it was asked explicitly, in writing, repeatedly, to make a complaint to the UN Committee for the Prevention of Torture, what did it do? It refused. It said, we can assure you that diplomatic means are going to be the best. Now, there are British residents in Guantanamo, long-term British residents, refugees. We have an absolute obligation under the Refugee Convention towards refugees. Given that status by this country, what is the response? We will do nothing. These are not British nationals. We can do nothing. And so one process after another has been used and abused by us, but not with any public discussion. Nobody knows it goes on. There is a slightly more public process, and that is making people available for extradition to other countries, in particular the US. Now that is a formal, legalistic process, but what have we done? We have declined to investigate and prosecute people here in courts. We have declined to do it. But what we have done in parallel is to enter into a new fast-track arrangement with the United States, not reciprocal, unilateral. We trade bodies one way, they don't trade bodies the other. They don't have to produce a prima facie case, but we send them there. We intend to send them there by fast track. People we know in this country, our police have told us, we find no evidence. Summing up, please. Gosh, there's a long way to go. Next week, two men, Babar Ahmed and Haroon Aswat, are intended by this country to be sent to the United States in the knowledge that the evidence against them has been obtained by coercion and torture, that they will be subject to a minimum of 35 years to life imprisonment minimum, and that they will be held in the most severe of prison conditions under special administrative measures. That's an avoidance. Just in one word, two words. The last and worst and most disgraceful and disgusting part of secrecy, the secret avoidance of what we could and should debate publicly, is the cruelty, the conscious, deliberate, knowing, willful use of cruelty. Torture, yes. Torture and all that goes with it is the macro horror of cruelty. There is also here in this country, under control orders, under people kept for deportation to countries where we know they will be tortured, there is the less obvious cruelty that is day in, day out. I have a host of examples I don't have time to give you, but the pettiness, the viciousness, and the way in which families here are subject to the same kind of stigma and despair of families kept under house arrest in South Africa during apartheid. All of that hasn't gone on publicly, hasn't gone on so that everybody, perhaps all of this audience, knows, and all credit to you. But it isn't really achieving the shock and the horror that any decent person would feel, the revulsion they'd feel against their government if they knew that they were inflicting even an ounce of this.
Thank you, Gareth. I will call speakers up two at a time. You have 3 minutes. I'll tap on the mic after 2 minutes and then tell you to stop after 3 minutes. If you could please keep to time, because we have quite a few speakers and people do need to get to the creche for 8:30 to pick their kids up as well. So the first 2 speakers are Jonathan Neal, followed by Deb Swinney.
I wish to speak in memory of Robin Goodenough. My partner lives on Alma Place, a small close in the centre of Oxford. Almost 3 years ago, in September, Robin Goodenough was driving a car and pulled into our street. He was followed by a police van that felt that he had been driving erratically. He had previously been arrested several times for joyriding and had had his license taken away. So when they told him to pull over, he pulled over and sat at the wheel of his car. Robin was afraid. He was a man with learning difficulties. He was a man with a stutter who found it difficult to speak in difficult and frightening circumstances. He rolled down the window. The police reached in and hit him through the window, opened the door, pulled him out of the door, threw him across the street, and then proceeded to kick him. 2 minutes after the police told him to pull over, they called the ambulance. We know that from the police tape. At some point before that ambulance got to the nearby hospital, Robin was dead. The police officers involved then had 48 hours. There were 9 police at the scene of the crime. They had 48 hours in which to talk to each other and get together any stories they wanted. The crime scene was not roped off. The council cleaners came and cleaned our street the next morning. Robin's family, his brother Tom, his mother Glenys, have gotten further with a justice case than anybody has that's been done to their son anywhere in this country. They got the police and the director of public prosecution to try 3 of the police officers for manslaughter. Because they had those 48 hours to get their stories together, we ended up with a hung jury. They came back again, and last week the trial ended of 2 police officers for bodily harm. And again, they were acquitted. There's no way to bring Robin back, and that's not justice. But there is still the inquest. The family is going for the inquest. They are going for the disciplinary action against the police, and they are going for the civil case. They know that they got as far as they did, further than any family has got in this country, because of all the campaigns for all the dead men that the police have killed. One day soon, I hope, we will see police not only tried but actually convicted for that kind of killing. But the last thing I want you to take is that what every house on Alma Place knows now and didn't know then. When this happened, there were many witnesses who watched out our windows, but we were all afraid and nobody came out onto the street. When you see that begin to happen on your street, come out onto the street. You may save a life, and if you do not save a life, you will have what we did not have in those cases, which is a person who can identify which police officer did the kicking. Because we must stop what happens in Guantanamo Bay, but what happens regularly on our own streets.
Deb Sweeney will be followed by Elaine Heffernan.
This was actually just a very quick question, which is that I keep reading that we now have human rights laws in the UK, and I don't understand how the extradition to the US can be compatible with those. It doesn't make sense to me. I wondered if you could comment on that.
No.
Thank you. Elaine Heffernan will be followed by Robert Maistow.
It's a real honour for me actually to speak here with Winston, because I once went to visit Winston Silcott in jail, and I wanted to talk a bit about some of the connections and this real bonfire of civil liberties, because I visited Winston when he was in jail, obviously supposed to have murdered a policeman, but I've also visited very often Harmondsworth, where they're locking up asylum seekers who haven't been accused of any crime at all, apart from the cheek of daring to enter this country, and other immigrants without permission to do so. And the level of security that they have brought in now, including my fingerprints and photograph and 3 doors and all kinds of amazing security that people have to go through inside the detention centres for asylum seekers. So they move from attacking people who've supposedly committed crimes to getting asylum seekers. Then you look at what they're doing in terms of deporting people, and there hasn't been much fuss actually. We've been trying to run campaigns around the people who are being deported for having committed petty crimes, because they are supposedly foreign criminals. Remember that scandal they haven't taken up in the press? They are deporting 16-year-old children when they committed their crime. They're deporting British citizens. Actually, they're usually losing in the courts at the last minute, but the scale of the bonfire of our civil liberties is huge. And you think about some of the other connections, much, much smaller than the things in terms of Guantanamo, but important in terms of New Labour's attitude towards our civil liberties. I cannot, when I am on strike, exercise my freedom to stand with more than 6 other people on a picket line. That has not been overturned. I can't organise in any kind of free way in terms of a trade union because they maintain those controls. And I think if you think, if you think about the attacks in terms of the anti-war movement, you go and stand with 1 placard and you're landed into jail. You even have a copy of The Independent with a story in, and you're in trouble and so on. That is why when Gareth goes to the hospital, people know what they are talking about, because the connections that have been made, I think over years, it is very different to when Winston was in jail. Then you couldn't really get many trade unions to take up the issues over civil liberties. You couldn't get people to campaign campaign in the same way, that I think we can now get a generation of workers, of anti-war activists, of students and so on, who have learned to connect and join up the dots. And I just want to finish, I'm sorry, by saying this, that actually in my union branch, we have won over the Forest Gate raids and over Jean-Charles Jimenez a position after argument and debate and so on that says that not only do we stand by Muslims, not only do we argue and take part in the marches over civil liberties, but that we believe that we should strike if these things happen again. We should, there's another bombing because it's the only way to get peace. And those bits and arguments are the thing that I think all of us have to join the dots and do. It's not just about listening and standing ovations, it's about how we can push into our class and our movement to join the dots and get our power.
Okay, Robert Maister will be followed by Matt Foote.
I just want to say a quick story, really, and how much pride I have seeing Winston Silcott up there free. I remember not long being in the SWP, and I think I was on my 4th paper cell in sunny old Enfield, North London, when we had a front page saying "Free to Tottenham, free." We had 2 policemen come past off duty shouting at us. We knew Keith Blakelock when we replied with, "What about Cynthia Jarrett? Don't you remember her?" This came into a standing row. We had my comrade had a policeman 2 inches from his face. I had a policeman 2 inches from my face. I thought we was going to go off into a big punch-up, but luckily it didn't. Just the thing I just want to say is that we proved them wrong and we won that argument then, and we were proved right in the end by Winston just being there. Thanks.
Thank you. Matt Foote will be followed by Jenny Witt.
Yes, I agree with Gareth that the biggest attack we face is on the jury system. The government hate the jury system because this is actually ordinary people deciding the fate. And the biggest attack on the jury system is the antisocial behaviour order. The way it works is if you behave in a way likely to cause alarm to any member of the community and the council want to go for you, or a police officer, they can get an order against you. No jury decides this, a magistrate decides, and 99.9% of the applications are granted. So you don't really want to be a defence solicitor with an ASBO case. The thing it seems to me from that is that they use this card of the antisocial behaviour when they're down, the Jimenez, when anything's going wrong in the war, they say, "Oh yeah, but we're doing well on antisocial behaviour," and they use it as a populist message. And I think we need to respond to say that the majority of people actually want to deal with the causes of crime, not just punish. They don't want to just see 1,000 more youth going into prison and just banning. That's the reality. And I was heartened by the local election results. People were interested in Tower Hamlets. I was most interested in Camden. Tony Blair came to Camden. Charles Clarke came to Camden. I think the only place in the country the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary come to say Camden is wonderful because they have masses of ASBOs. I mean, more ASBOs in Camden than anywhere else in the country. It's a wonderful place to be, a wonderful place to live. The only problem was that the Labour Party there got the worst result in 35 years. The leader of the council went, all these people went, and I was very pleased. I got an email this week from the new Lib Dem guys taking over ASBOs, to ASBO Concern saying we're going to review every ASBO and we want to talk to ASBO Concern about it. And I'll just finish on this point that it is very, very depressing and there's not, what the government have done and what John Reid is going to carry on doing. But there are things that we can do, and that's why I come back to what Winston said about we can fight. I mean, over 40 organisations have come together to support ASBO Concern, including Mind, and there are people speaking up every day, Bernardo's. I mean, I never thought I'd be lining up with sort of Bernardo's and Mind and all these sort of people. But I think we can expose the brutality of the punishment agenda by linking up, and that's the role of socialists, it seems to me, is to link up with other socialists and non-socialists to expose the lies and to try and organise activity.
Thank you. Jenny Witt will be followed by Linda Marshall. Sorry.
I was trying to think back and compare the Labour government and the Tories, and when you look back at years. I mean, my first Marxism would have been 1988, and I think shortly after that the Criminal Justice Bill came in, and we were shaking at the horror of raves being prohibited in the countryside and how terrible was all that. And of course the trade union laws, the anti-trade union laws were in force at that stage already. But when I think back now, I think the key difference to me is that at the time the Tories were trying to criminalise trade unionists and organised labour. What New Labour is trying to do now, I think, is that it is trying to criminalise every single section of the population. When you look at the range and the breadth of things that are going on, from Guantanamo and Belmarsh through to all the overcrowded prisons that now contain people who failed to pay their bills, you look at non-jury trials, police shootings, ASBOs, electronic tagging, phone and electronic surveillance, CCTV, seems innocuous, but it's being done supposedly in our name. That's the big argument that's being made. It's done in our name because people feel more secure in town centres. ASBOs are being imposed because it improves estates, problem estates, and so on. These things are being used. The argument that the government is making is that that's what people want, and that's where we come in, because we have to stand up and say, no, it is bloody well not what people want. What people want is a society where civil liberties are treasured, where people are not stopped at the airports, they're not whisked away to detention centres, not to be seen for 3 years, where people haven't, 12, 16 years of their lives stolen like so many black and Irish people in this country. It's ridiculous when you think of the range of civil liberties that has been taken away under New Labour, and every single Home Secretary is more right-wing than the previous one, and they don't even do us the favour of killing themselves involving tights and an orange like some Tory ministers used to do. I think that is really trying to lighten the mood slightly, but I think what is going on is so serious at this point that we need to knit these campaigns together. When we talk about the war not being fought in our name, we need to at the same time talk about the civil liberties that are being taken away from us for the sake of the war, for the sake of protecting this country from terrorism. The war is not in our name, these laws are not in our name, and I think that's why we need to stand up. Lawyers like Gareth, thankfully, ring the alarm bells, and I think perhaps it's difficult to make something like these legal steps interesting and sexy, and I work in the media, and I know that the media aren't good at taking these things up, but it really needs to be translated into very accessible information to tell people what is going on and how we've been deprived of our civil liberties, and it is not in our name.
Linda Marshall will be followed by Tim Duke.
It's just a short question for Mazzam about those 3 tragic suicides recently in Guantanamo Bay, and those disgraceful comments made about them being an act of war, I think was said. Hold on, what was I going to say? Yeah, I heard another American commentator come on the radio and say that it's possible they were murders. I don't know if anybody else heard that. And I just wondered if what Mazzam thought, is that possible? Could it have been murders covered up and made to look like suicide?
Thank you. I have 2 questions. Tim's is actually a question. It says, are ASBOs a form of working class status symbol? And if so, what would the speakers most like to get one for? The next question is, has Tony Blair ever apologised to the prisoners who came back from Guantanamo Bay? Has he ever tried to make contact with the prisoners after their return? The next speaker is Simon Folarin. He will be followed by Dean Scurlock. So no Simon Folarin? Okay.
Yeah, I've just 2 questions for Winston. Since when you were sentenced for murder, was it? Yeah, and you didn't do it. Do you think the law has changed and now they're giving more harsher sentences to the black youth nowadays? Recently, there's been a lot of cases of 30 years and more they've been given to young people. Yeah?
I'll answer that later on.
That was Dean Scurlock, to be followed by Louise Clark.
Hello. Just pick up on a couple of points that Mazzam and Gareth mentioned. about the erosion of our rights and our liberties over the years. You've had the abolition of the right to silence with Michael Howard, with this new bizarre caution by the police where if you don't say anything, they can imply that you are guilty, where you had the right not to incriminate yourself before. There might be reasons why people remain silent, not getting someone else into danger, or whatever reason. Right to trial by jury, eroded in many, many cases. And then Tony Blair comes into power, he brings out the Human Rights Act, 1998, which he says this is a symbol of our commitment to human rights, to justice. You know, he's a former lawyer. He said, I'm standing up for the rights of people in Britain. Then it comes across that, you know, where was the human rights of Charles de Menezes, of the Belmarsh prisoners for 3 years? You've seen Tony Blair now saying the rules of the game have changed. He wants to turn back on the Human Rights Act, to try and water it down. It's quite watered down as it is. He wants to, David Cameron says when he gets in power, we're going to get rid of the Human Rights Act. We're going to bring in a Bill of Rights. He won't say what that means. So I'd like to ask Gareth what she thinks the implications are of these attacks on the Human Rights Act. Does she believe it goes far enough in protecting our rights?
Thank you. Louise Clark will be followed by Alan Crowe.
I want to say something about the reality of what faces people when they are on the wrong end of the criminal justice system. I do support work with women offenders, women basically, in a women's prison in Gloucestershire. And I don't know how much people know about prisons, but just the day-to-day sort of brutality of the regime and what it does to people. And also, the sort of people that you're seeing ending up in prison, just a sort of snapshot of the sort of stuff that goes on where I am. It's just the language used towards the women by the staff, the sort of degrading language and the sexist language. The fact that where I am, there was something like the top 3 prison that's got really bad self-harm issues. 1 month there were 400 issues of self-injury by women. You've got women smashing their heads against the cell doors because they've got mental health issues. You've got women slashing their throats in front of you because of their mental health issues. You've got, when your post comes round, you don't say, Louise Clark, your post is here. It's Clark, your post is here, down the corridor. This is what we're doing to people in prison. And if you look about who these people are that are in prison, it's working class women. It's working class women with mental health issues. It's working class women that have got debt issues. It's working class women that have got drug and alcohol addiction. And what we're seeing is this idea that we're going to privatise the services to these women through the National Offender Management Scheme. We're going to enable people like Sainsbury's and B&Q to provide the counselling services. We're going to have people making money off the back of supposedly helping these women. This is the regime, this is the system that we're punishing the working class women with. And, the idea that on top of that, you're going to have miscarriages of justice continuing and seeing people end up in these situations. So really, what we need to be doing is, fighting privatisation of any of our services, fighting things like ASBOs and community orders, which, if the services aren't there to prop up the sentences, then people are just going to end up on that revolving door and coming back into prison, and fighting for the end of imprisonment of people for, they're not crimes, they're victims of being working class.
Thank you. And Alan Crowe will be followed by Ray, unless this is a question you want me to read out.
No.
It's a question. Okay, let me just read this out, Alan, before you come in. How can we erode liberties we don't have? Like the Magna Carta curtailed the king, does the panel think we should have a constitution that could curtail the government and its legal system? P.S. The quote that comes to mind, when power over the people weakens, the chains are made tighter. And Alan will be the final speaker.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow on from Jonathan Neal's point about the killing of the fellow in Oxford, because Gareth talked about Barbara Ahmed, and when he was arrested on the terror raid, there was 3 other people got arrested at the same time. And one of them was our neighbour, and I can tell you there's nothing more terrifying about than one of these terror raids when they smash down the doors and all the rest of it. And we actually did go out in the street for that very reason. We knew about Brian Douglas and all the other people who'd been killed by the police. And we went out there, and I can tell you the police weren't very pleased when they saw me with a camera and to make sure. But when you think about it, Barbara Ahmed actually took a severe kicking that night, and I'd like to think that actually going out prevented that happening to our neighbour. But and I also wanted to emphasise as well, these terror raids and the way they do it, and the thousands of police just pour down on your house. It's to emphasise that sense of vulnerability, and it's really tangible. If you're on a demo and a police riot and they attack you, you can always go home and forget about it and lick your wounds and that. But when they smash up your home, well, where'd you go after that? When they're right there, and in fact, there's nowhere else you can go. And that's why it is important to get out in the street as well, to overcome that sense of vulnerability. We actually took a card round our street after our neighbour had been arrested, saying, we don't think you're a terrorist, and we support you. And we wanted to give that to our next door neighbour, to the parents and whatnot. And the response was really good, because people, not only people signed it, but they actually were saying, they were more frightened of the police than they thought they were about any ideas that our neighbour were a terrorist. And there's a cruel irony to this. Just the other night, it was almost like an anniversary in a way when it happened. But there was a police chase in our street, and our car got smashed up as part of it, and these 3 lads got arrested. But we were straight out there again, especially since it was our car smashed up. And of course, this time though, all the neighbours were, they weren't hiding behind curtains anymore. The curtains were open, they're all watching, and they saw us down in the street as well. And the most remarkable thing about it, and uplifted, I thought, was that when we were talking to our neighbours afterwards, there weren't no, people get these ideas about, they must have been doing something to be arrested and, drink driving, drugs, whatever. There was none of that. There was, they thought the police were lying when they said they were rammed and that's why they hit our car. Maybe they hit our car, and it was the way. They said, why was it they were beating these lads? And, it was unnecessary. They were in the car and all the rest of it. There was no questioning about them. All the question was entirely about the police. And like I say, as Jonathan Neal pointed out, if you get out in the streets, you prevent someone getting a kick in and prevent someone getting killed. But then if you make sure you go around to your neighbours and you discuss that, you overcome the vulnerability you feel yourself, but also you let people feel that actually they can do something about it. They're not at the whim of the police, and they can make a difference.
I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to the excellent discussion, and I'd just like to apologise to all the people who...
Good evening. I think what I will tell you is worse than all story, because it is continuously happening till now. I'm living under organized, mobilized racism, which is happening through legal constitution. Till now 6 years. It is happening. I'm living in Leeds. The most people in Leeds know about it. Some of them, they do as they don't know about it because of political reasons. I can't tell you now about the details, but who needs the details, you can find it with me. 2 months ago, I speak with this gentleman when I came here when I come to Marxism school. He told me that I will come to, because he works in organization, anti-fascism. I will come to Leeds and I will discuss with you. I don't know, he don't come to Leeds. This is organized racism. They say that it is under the table. Now, starting from May, in the table. Because the police, with some people, organize some false incidents to put me in prison. They say that I kick someone. In that time, which is police says that I kick someone, I was being in the meeting with council officer. Me and my family, we all living in this country. I am a scandal of civil rights. I'm a scandal of those who speaking about human rights. I am a scandal of those who is speaking about principality and equality. This is me.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to bring the speakers back in to sum up on the discussion. I'll bring in Gareth first.
Just if there is summing up possible for this, we are in a state of emergency. It is, and not just this country, there is an international onslaught on minimum obligations in respect of human rights. Internationally, there is a concerted effort to take them away. And it is a defensive action we're fighting. We should not delude ourselves. Rights are there to be enjoyed and to be aggressively fought for. We are now in a situation where we're being made to feel defensive, that we're having to fight to keep them at all. One tiny anecdote. Just a short while ago, there was a meeting about control orders in the House of Lords. Tiny meeting, not an SWP meeting with rich attendance. Very few people. The title of the meeting was The Nightmare of Control Orders, and it was hosted by a member of the House of Lords. On the day, police officers went to the house of two control orderees, men, giving them a letter from the Home Office saying, there is a meeting tonight at the House of Lords. If you think you're going, you'll be in breach of the control order and arrested because you cannot go to a meeting without the prior permission of the Home Office. Neither man had the slightest intention of going. At the meeting, there spoke their wives and their daughters. They also were the victims of the control order, and that had not crossed the Home Office mind, and still does not cross the Home Office mind as it seeks to maintain an order controlling the whole family. But the member of the House of Lords himself, uniquely, was hauled over the coals by the House of Lords administration for hosting a provocative meeting and asked why he could use the term nightmare in relation to the control orders. And he said, you seem to have forgotten. The House of Lords, a few months ago, found in favour of these same men and said, this is the nightmare. The Law Lord said, this is the nightmare. They were their words, and the Home Office could not deal with that.
Thank you, Gareth. Now bring in Winston.
I'll make this short and sweet. Bit by bit, our civil liberties, our rights, have been eroded. And over the years, I mean, what I've seen from my experience, people seem to be accepting it. You do get the odd cases, obviously, where they come out and they fight against the system. But I think it's all of our duty, not just us sitting here, family, friends. We've got to clue up everybody to stop this from happening. And to Jono's question, right? Where he said, sentence of a black and mixed youth, is it too harsh, right? I think, for instance, my pet hate is the media, right? The media tend to identify people, and easy to identify black people. So when they want to make a point to the general public and youth in general, because they do, as you know, the media don't like the youth. There's never any good stories about young people. It's always something negative. They seem to, when it comes to black young people, they seem to, not all, but some seem to get a disproportionate sentence. But I think they just do it, obviously, to send a message out to all of us to sort of keep us in our place. Okay, thank you.
Before I bring Mazzam in, there's just a couple of announcements. The first one is, if anyone has found a mobile phone, can they hand it in at the front? Don't forget to come and buy Mazzam's book before you go, and he'll also be signing copies of his book as well. There's 2 demonstrations. Mazzam's just told me to announce a demonstration on the 15th of July at Marble Arch, which is about closing down Guantanamo Bay. And also, hopefully, we'll see everyone in this hall and all your friends and families and colleagues from work at the big demonstration outside Labour Conference in September. So hopefully we'll all be there. So there's lots of things that we can be doing to keep the pressure up and to make sure that real justice is sought for the people that have been the victims. So I'll bring in Mazzam.
12 o'clock.
12 o'clock for the Marble Arch demonstration.
The question I was asked about was about has Tony Blair ever apologised to the prisoners who returned from Guantanamo Bay? I had a letter from the Home Office under the royal prerogative which said that I'm no longer allowed to travel outside of the UK. So that's the only present I've had from Mr. Blair, apart from the reception that I and the other 3 detainees returned at Paddington Green, which was pretty good because they had cultural meals ready for us. Those are pretty good. On a more serious note, about the suicides, the question that you asked, I, for one, have had debates on the radio and television with the United States public relations secretaries and others who have said, I quote, "I don't care what the world thinks. These were acts of asymmetric warfare." And that's absolute nonsense. Anybody who's been in that situation, and there aren't many, I suppose, who have, but anybody who has been there knows that these people were on hunger strikes. If they were on hunger strikes, they would have been deemed to be level 4. Now, level 4, for a level 4 person, even toilet paper is deemed to be a privileged item. The United States of America military in Guantanamo has told us that they wrote suicide notes. Now, how could they do that if they're level 4s? If you're a level 4 and you're in an MSU block, a maximum security block, there is nowhere which you could tie blankets or sheets if you had them to begin with. So there are all sorts of questions, and on top of that, I phoned the fathers of at least 2 of those detainees who died in Guantanamo, and they're not buying it at all. Just like in any other situation, if somebody was to die in custody of the police or the military in a normal situation, there would be an independent, transparent inquiry. There hasn't been one, so we can't take their word for it. To finish off, there are some important points. Gareth talked about them, and for me in particular. There are several British residents in this country, in this city in fact, who are in Guantanamo Bay, or from this city who are in Guantanamo Bay. Their wives and their children are here. 2 of them have had children born since they've been in custody, i.e. they have never seen their children. I know exactly what that's like. My child was born 6 months after I was kidnapped. They have never, ever seen their children. And I visit them sometimes. And every time I go there with my head hung in shame, because there's nothing I can tell those children. Those children, who know my children, ask the question, when is my dad coming home? And I don't know how to answer it. And some people have said that we've got to close down Guantanamo. That's true, but there are things taking place here. But there's an important point about Guantanamo Bay. It's a symbol. It's a symbol of oppression that we're seeing in this day and age. Remember that we were told when Afghanistan was invaded that it was called Operation Enduring Freedom. Now ask yourself this question. At what point was America's freedom ever in jeopardy? Not its security. It's the language they've been playing with. It's freedom. When was it ever at jeopardy? And in fact, what we understand now is that it is Operation Enduring Freedom because the freedom is in jeopardy, but not from the terrorists. It's for the people that are in power. If you look in this country, the types of things that have happened post 7/7, and continually, even after the government was defeated about this bill for bringing 90 days without trial, they're trying to revitalize it again. And I get people like me get confused, who've been through this sort of, the system, and we're told again and again, oh, we're going to rehash this, and we're going to bring it back again. I thought it was all over. And as long as this type of attitude continues, and the government feels like it can get away with it, then I think we've got a bleak future here. If we don't make a stand, then I don't think anybody else will. And I just want to finish on a final note, on a personal note. I used to have many discussions with Guantanamo guards in my maximum security isolation block, which was a tiny cell. One of the guards I used to speak to quite often was from the US Virgin Islands, and he was more Jamaican than he was American, sort of mainland American. So we used to discuss these issues about identity, how American he felt, how British I felt. And I said to him, it dawned on me that, the last time in history that people were extraordinarily rendered from a dark continent, of a dark people, most of whom were Muslims, in chains across the Atlantic by the Americans, was slavery. That's food for thought.
Thank you.